for the launch of the Inclusion Measurement Guide. Today is a big day for the Commission in that it's the culmination of over a year's work across many financial services organizations coming together to really bring together the importance of the work of the Commission and the importance of understanding the skills that are going to be needed for financial services to continue to lead the way. This morning, I think, Josh, you were going to put up an agenda slide. We're going to hear from a few speakers. The first being Irene McDermott Brown, the Chief People Officer from M&G, followed by Georgina Philippou from the FCA. Josh Rae from the Commission is going to walk us through the highlights of the guide to really gain an understanding of the work and the framework that's being published later today. I'm then going to talk about the work at M&G, how we're measuring inclusion, why that's so important to us as an organization and to the industry more broadly. I'm then going to be joined for a panel discussion with Anna Jernova, a senior manager from the Bank of England, Rebecca Antonini, director from First Sentier, and Claire Tunley, the CEO of the Commission. And I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves in more depth when we get to the question and answer part of the discussion today. We are going to invite everyone on the call that if you have any questions throughout today's call and presentation, please put them in the chat. Josh will be monitoring the chat, and I'll stop from time to time to ask if there are questions so they can be addressed as they come in. So with that all said, I think we've got our housekeeping in order. It's my great pleasure to introduce Irene McDermott Brown, the Chief People Officer from M&G Plc. Over to you, Irene.
Mark, thank you very much. Hopefully I've mastered the mute off and camera on, I hope so. I'd like to thank, first of all, Mark Hoban and Claire Tunley from the Commission for inviting me to open the session today. I think inclusion is such a critical topic for our businesses in this day and age. And as the Chief Human Resources Officer at M&G, I felt strongly that becoming a founder member of the Financial Services Skills Commission was important for both us as a firm, but also to support the wider financial services sector. M&G's commitment to having a more diverse and inclusive company aligns well with the aims of the Commission. And as we all know, the world of work is changing rapidly around us, and this last year has only accelerated that change. The scale of disruption with things like Brexit and now the pandemic have been huge for us all as businesses and the workforce out there. And the Commission was established to ensure that our sector can identify and secure the talent and skills that it needs for the future, and importantly, to improve the diversity of talent within the sector. This is a sector which contributed in excess of something like, I think, 132 billion to the economy in 2019 alone. So it's crucial to our economy. And as such a significant contributor, we've got such an important role to play in ensuring our sector benefits society far more broadly. And being a founder member of the Commission and a board member enables M&G to contribute to this agenda. The work of the Commission brings together industry, government, the education sector, and we hope to help to overcome our sector's skills gap and to increase the recruitment and retention of a more diverse workforce. It's about making financial services an attractive employment sector for all. Today, we're here to introduce one of the important outputs of this collaboration, which has come out of the Commission's workstream on diversity and inclusion. One of the workstream's ambitions is to help companies to understand the importance of clear diversity and inclusion, data collection and reporting, because frankly, what gets measured and reported is what gets done. We've developed an inclusion measurement guide and to provide a common way that firms can improve the way that they measure inclusion and to see how they're doing. Later in the session, they're going to share more detail on the actual guide and the framework. but it's designed to help organisations of all sizes and levels of maturity. And the Guide to Inclusion focuses on ways to measure inclusive leadership. So core to a healthy culture is having leaders who are inclusive and set the right tone. And we all know that leaders set the tone. They set it from the top right the way through the organisation. And then the second attribute of a healthy culture is safety to speak up. And safety to speak up is crucial. And so that's another aspect of measuring inclusion. And then that's all fine, but you've got to make sure that that's embedded in your systems, your processes, and that it's reinforced day in, day out, which includes things like recruitment processes, progression processes, and development. And that's another aspect of the guide. So measuring inclusion is not just about employee engagement. It goes further. It's trying to get an understanding of where your organisation is having a positive impact on employees and where you need to improve. And so it's meant to be simple, it's meant to be practical, which we hope it is. But before getting into more detail about the framework itself, we're going to hear from the FCA about their work on culture across financial services, which aligns very well with this work. And so it's a real pleasure of mine to introduce Georgina Philippou from the FCA. She is Senior Advisor to the FCA to hear more about the FCA's work in this space. Georgina, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope it says Georgina Philippou under my name rather than Joshua Rae. That would be a really good start. I'm delighted to have been invited to this event to welcome the excellent and very practical inclusion measurement guide from the FSSC. We often talk about diversity and inclusion as though it were one very long compound word. But of course, diversity and inclusion are two closely related but very different things. And while the conversation about D&I has been going on for years, if not decades, and still has a long way to go, inclusion tends to be the less talked about element. This is partly because diversity is easier to see and to measure than inclusion. Our efforts in data, better collection, use and analysis tend to focus on diversity rather than inclusion, when we need the latter to explain the former. Gender and ethnicity pay gap data are a good example of this. We focus on the protected characteristics when we know that inclusion goes way beyond simple demographic descriptors. We prove correlation between diversity and business outcomes, but we still struggle with the causation which lies behind successful inclusion. And diversity without inclusion becomes just a numbers game. If the diverse people we bring into our organisations cannot thrive and progress and are not heard, if they cannot contribute and don't feel valued, then we do not achieve the change that we need. As the FSSC says, all employees should feel equally respected, supported, and valued for their distinct characteristics, so they're able to perform to their full potential. The importance of inclusion is what lies behind a lot of the conversations we have with firms about culture. As Irene said, we talk about psychological safety and the value of a speak up, listen up culture, where people can bring their whole selves to work and differences are embraced. We see a connection between this and productive and innovative businesses, which can better understand and meet their customers' needs and generate better customer and market outcomes. And what is this all about, if not inclusion? One of the challenges I frequently hear from regulated firms is, culture and inclusion are such nebulous concepts. How do I get my arms around them? How do I measure them? How do I know that I'm making progress? It isn't helpful that culture is often described as how we do things around here. And I recently heard culture described as a slow-moving river, always changing. But rivers can be made to speed up or slow down or to change direction. And the good news is that there is plenty out there to help you measure culture and inclusion. The FCA's key drivers of culture are a good starting point. If you break down what your firm does into the 4 drivers, so number 1, purpose, whether your business model is fit for purpose, whether your strategy is clearly articulated and delivered, how your culture is set top down and bottom up, and probably middle out too, whether you have articulated the outcomes you want to achieve and are monitoring them. Number 2, leadership. Look at representation at board and executive levels. Look at the tone that leadership is setting for the organisation. 3, people. Here, look at representation across your organisation. Look at data showing who is rewarded and what for, how opportunities are allocated. Listen to what your staff are saying about your culture and whether they feel included. And 4, governance. We expect firms to thoroughly understand the risks arising from their business models and to promote a culture to effectively manage those risks through having things like the right oversight, systems, controls, policies, and processes. This sounds dull, but is incredibly important. Systems, controls, policies, and processes are easier to change than people and behaviours, and they can make it easier or harder to instill a positive and inclusive culture. We try to assess culture in our day-to-day supervision work. We analyse business models and strategies to identify the key risks presented by a firm's activities. We then assess how effective the firm's culture is in mitigating these risks. There are both objective and subjective factors which can be used to evidence this, and we build a coherent narrative through using data, information, and judgment. We've also found that a number of firms measure culture indicators as part of their risk management, and while there are differences in approach, there are common themes. And these common themes include use of staff survey results, D&I metrics, whistleblowing, grievances and disciplinaries, and consumer trust measures, among others. Some firms then use some of these in the non-financial part of their balanced scorecards to determine remuneration outcomes. And other organisations, such as the Investment Association and the Financial Services Culture Board and Women in Banking and Finance, have published useful material, including case studies on what good looks like. And today's report from the FSSC adds to that canon, particularly as it's presented in such a way that you can lift it directly into your firm's materials. Now, why diversity and inclusion matter? Well, the investment, business and regulatory cases for diversity and inclusion have been made in hundreds of academic and other reports. More diverse and inclusive financial services firms are less likely to engage in misconduct, receive smaller fines when they do, and are more likely to be better able to reflect and meet the needs of their customers, reducing harm to consumers and improving market outcomes. Both the FCA and the FSSC want an innovative financial services sector which works for the benefit of consumers and markets. However, despite this, we also know that in many respects the pace of change has been slow. For example, how can it be right that only 17% of holders of FCA senior management functions are women? All of this explains why last week we published our discussion paper on diversity and inclusion alongside the Prudential Regulation Authority and the Bank of England. This opens up a conversation with the financial services sector about what kind of regulatory interventions might help move the dial on D&I in the sector. And alongside the DP, we're also publishing an extensive literature review, which looks at well over 100 research reports about the impact of D&I on firm outcomes. It shows a strong link between more gender diverse and more ethnically diverse leadership and positive business outcomes. But I would argue that the moral and ethical case for diversity and inclusion is more important and more compelling than the business and investment case. This is particularly true right now. The resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the unequal impact of the pandemic on different groups of people have been wake-up calls for all of us. People are increasingly talking about equality as the biggest human rights issue of our time. And as ESG continues to move up the agenda, it will take D&I with it. But back to today's theme, measurement. As we have seen, inclusion can be and needs to be measured in many different ways. It's a multifaceted concept, so it needs to be measured in multifaceted ways using qualitative and quantitative information, internal and external, to build that coherent narrative that I mentioned earlier. Today's FSSC guide focuses on 3 key areas: inclusive leadership, a safe and speak up culture, and inclusive systems and processes. And it provides some questions you can ask your staff. But I would argue that it's also the case that in an internet and social media age, we are inundated with feedback, whether we like it or not. So a holistic approach to measuring inclusion will of course include staff feedback. And alongside this, you can look at feedback from customers, counterparties, shareholders and suppliers, and the media and social media. And if you want to be really cutting edge, you can use anthropology and ethnography to analyse the behaviours in your organisation. Data and hard metrics can also be used to measure inclusion. Our D&I dashboard at the FCA analyses new employee information, turnover, tenure, acting up opportunities, and internal development programmes. It allows us to look at trends over time and drives focused and positive action. We combine this with other data and information such as pay gap data and employee survey results to inform our strategy and allow us to target positive action. We then use data to measure the impact of our actions. A lot of organisations worry that GDPR means they cannot collect good quality data, or that colleagues will be reluctant to disclose their personal information. But you can gather useful data lawfully. The Investment Association recently published a guide, and there's also guidance on the ICO website, although it is a prerequisite that you have to build the trust of your employees if you are to get meaningful responses. So you have to reassure colleagues that data will be anonymous or anonymized, and you have to be transparent about how you will use the data and show that it will be used for a worthwhile purpose. And that brings me to my punchline. What do we want to achieve with the regulatory D&I discussion paper we published last week? Well, of course, we want to see more diverse and inclusive financial services firms. But important though that is in itself, that is not the end point for us. We want better D&I in firms to feed through into the design and delivery of products and services, into products and services reaching a more diverse customer base in the right way, and ultimately into better consumer and market outcomes. We also want to improve our understanding of the state of diversity and inclusion in the industry by collecting data from firms, and we want data collection in firms to improve. The paper suggests some interventions that we think will drive improvements. We're really keen to get feedback on these, plus any other ideas you might have. And so the paper is open for comment until the end of September. And please, please share your views. In the meantime, our key messages are simple. We take D&I seriously, and we expect regulated firms to do so too. And you can expect us to start a conversation about D&I in many of our interactions with regulated firms, when authorising firms, when approving senior individuals, supervising firms and sectors, and in enforcement. Thank you once again to the FSSC for inviting me here today, and congratulations and good luck with the guide. I wish I could stay for the rest of the event, but I'm afraid I have to rush off in just a couple of minutes, but thank you very much.
Georgina, before we hand over to Josh, can I also send a thank you for joining us today? And also thank you for really talking about the importance of data collection, both quantitative and qualitative. And I think that's missed a bit at times. We tend to think the quantitative is most important. And that balance that you so rightly said this morning really feeds back into everything the FCA is looking at. Would you agree?
That's absolutely right. This is a complicated area, and there is no one single measure that's going to give you an answer. So you have to gather together all of the feedback that you can get in order to build that narrative.
And you also talked about the speak up culture and trust. And I think sometimes as firms, we get more caught up in the development of the systems. And really what you're saying is it's the output that's more important, is listening to colleagues and then bringing that back into the work.
Yes, absolutely. But systems, as your guide points out, and as I mentioned, are also important, and they're easier to change. Systems, processes, policies are easier to change than people and their behaviours. So if you design them to make the right behaviour easy and the wrong behaviour difficult, you will be halfway there.
So I just, one last thing before you go, I know you have to go, but really what I heard you saying today is the FCA is going to be looking at regulated firms, and are we delivering on the intent of this work rather than just the framework? Great. Georgina, thank you again for joining us this morning. I know you have to leave us, but thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure. Good luck with the panel. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to turn over to Josh Rae. And this is the Josh Rae who's come on screen. Thank you, Josh. And for those of you who may see your name coming up as Josh Rae, I'll just give everyone a reminder that you can rename yourself, and we would encourage you to do that for the question and answer period. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Mark, and hello to all of my doppelgangers who joined us today. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking you through the Inclusion Measurement Guide, what it is and how to use it, as well as touching on some of the reasoning behind measuring inclusion in the first place. My colleague Katerina is also going to post a link to the Inclusion Measurement Guide, which you can download from the Financial Services Skills Commission website after this event. Thank you, Charlie, for the slides. So the Inclusion Measurement Guide has been created to support firms with their inclusion analysis and metrics. It's suitable for firms no matter what stage they're at with their inclusion measurement, with the overall aim being to improve inclusion measurement across the financial services sector. The Inclusion Measurement Guide will help firms measure inclusion across 3 priority areas, which Georgina already touched on. These are inclusive leadership, a safe and speak up culture, and inclusive systems and processes, for example, your recruitment or your progression processes. The guide will help firms collect information based on employee perceptions, similar to how inclusion is often measured in employee engagement surveys, but also measure inclusion on the actions of employees and the structures within the organisation which impact the culture of the firm. For example, things like your bonus criteria. Now, before I dive into the guide, I wanted to first set out our definition of inclusion, because I think it's important that we all understand what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion, and this is the definition that was used when we built the guide. So we say that inclusion is about creating belonging without conformity. All employees should feel equally respected, supported and valued for their distinct characteristics, so they're able to perform to their full potential. An inclusive company is where employees feel like they belong and are valued without discrimination, bias or negative behaviour, and there is a culture of fairness and trust. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about why it's important to measure inclusion. So measuring inclusion is key to increasing the inclusivity of an organisation's culture. It speaks to the old adage of what gets measured gets managed. It's very hard to show if your efforts to improve inclusion are working without any sort of measurement. And it also provides evidence to introduce further improvements to culture once you've shown that some of the things that you're doing are having an impact. Being able to talk about your measures of inclusion also allows you to enhance your brand with your customers and also attract talented and skilled individuals from a more diverse talent pool. You can really use it as a selling point when you're going to market for new talent. Team leaders can also use the inclusion data to build teams who are more understanding of each other, and this has been shown to then lead to them being more committed to their work. So now we discuss why we created the guide. I want to spend a bit of time walking you through how the guide can be used. So the guide is split into 4 levels of inclusion measurement, and this really depends on where you are with your firm's data collection maturity and also your ambitions for inclusion measurement. So if you go to the next slide, please, Charlie. So level 1 is aimed at organisations just starting to measure inclusion, and it suggests 3 questions, 1 for each of the priority areas. So 1 on inclusive leadership, the example being, my manager cultivates an inclusive environment at work. A question on safe and speak up culture, the example being, I feel safe to speak up if I I observe inappropriate behaviour. And then finally, one on inclusive systems and processes. The example being, I have fair access to opportunities in my organisation. Now, the questions we suggest throughout the guide are just examples, but they should give you a good idea of the sorts of questions you could be asking under each heading. But you may want to tweak them slightly depending on questions you already ask, similarity to other questions, and if you do any sort of cognitive testing on how those questions land with your employees. It might also change depending on which demographic groups you work in or which countries you're working across. The majority of the questions are designed to be asked with a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. So for the example, my manager cultivates an inclusive environment at work, you'd give the options of strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree nor disagree, agree, or strongly agree for people to then respond to. And you could do this across 5 points, or you could split it across 10 and have multiple numbers linked to each answer. Some companies like to use a sort of sliding scale from 1 to 100. It allows that sort of flexibility. Now, you'll also notice that the example for safe and speak up culture is written in bold. And this is to highlight to you that it's one of the questions that's asked in the Financial Services Culture Board survey. And this is really to give you an example of where you might already be collecting some of this data. And I'll touch on this again in a moment. So if you go to the next slide, please. So level 2 of the inclusion measurement guide then adds on to those 3 questions the different perspectives you could start to look at inclusion from. So for example, looking at inclusive leadership from the perspective of employee perceptions, as well as the actions of individuals and the structures in place in the organisation. And this sets out with an example for each of the 3 priority areas across perceptions, actions and structures, and you get those examples throughout the guide for each of those. And we do also include in the guide some example surveys of how you might put these questions together. So if you could flick onto the next slide, please, Charlie. So a level 2 survey might look something like this. We've got the 3 core questions from level 1, and then further questions on inclusive leadership to get that additional perspective. So you might do this if leadership was a particular focus for your firm, or if in some of the other culture work you've been doing, inclusive leadership has come up as something of particular interest or a bit of an issue. And there is further detail in the guide on the differences between the different levels, and there are additional example surveys for the different levels to show you how you can put these questions together. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. So level 3 then adds an additional level of detail by sort of zooming in on some of those specific areas of your business where inclusion is important. So if we look only at inclusive leadership again, this breaks down into 3 areas. So we've got inclusive leadership in relation to the top level of leadership, your senior managers. And this is about the impact that they will have on the company culture. And then we're also looking at sort of middle management layer, which is likely to have more of an everyday impact on your employees' experience of the culture of the firm. And then we've got the sort of peer-to-peer dialogues that people have when they're leading each other within their teams or leading themselves at work. And there are examples of each of the areas being broken down within the guide. Level 3 also introduces a couple of other elements. So again, we have highlighted in bold the questions which appear in the Financial Services Culture Board survey, which many of you may already be completing, and this will avoid you having to duplicate any data collection. And it will also allow you to benchmark with some of those questions that you're already asking, and in that report that you get from the FSCB, you'll be able to use some of those questions to do your own internal benchmarking. There are also some questions highlighted with an asterisk. And these aren't questions you would necessarily ask in a survey, but there's some additional data collection you may want to do alongside asking the questions, which will highlight some of the structures in your business and how they may be impacting the inclusivity of your culture. So one of the examples given here is looking at the percentage of bonus payments, which is linked to your inclusivity measures. And so that gives you an extra element of when you're looking at inclusive leadership. If we go to the next slide, please. So level 4 then adds some free text questions to the other measurement to get some of that richer insight. So for example, asking employees to reflect on how leadership could be more inclusive. So whilst we called this level 4, you could actually add this on to any of the other levels to get that additional qualitative data to sit alongside the other data you are collecting, especially if there is particular issues or focuses you want to identify, or if there's any feedback that you want to get from employees when you're doing this inclusion measurement. Now, in addition to all of this, the guide provides a couple of example surveys to show you how you can build the questions together into a full survey. It also includes a list of some of the demographic data you may want to collect alongside the inclusion data, and this will help you get a bit more out of your results. So some examples of this are characteristics like gender, age, and ethnicity, but also things like team, role, and tenure to identify any trends, problem areas, or success stories in your business. So for example, you could use this and you might look at your long tenured employees in sales and find that they feel more included than your shorter tenured employees in your sales team. And then you can adjust your inclusion survey questions to try and find out a bit more about why that might be. You know, what is it that is impacting this group more than this group? So that's everything from me. I hope you'll enjoy using the guide. And if you do have any specific questions on the guide, I'll be happy to pick them up at the end in the Q&A, or feel free to email me after the session. Thank you. Back to you, Mark, if you can turn your camera back on and come off mute.
Great, thank you, Josh. And thank you for the comprehensive walkthrough of the inclusion measurement guide. I'm really excited this morning about this guide, and I hope everyone on the call sees the value in having a framework by which you can really start the work, or potentially also enhance the work that each of your firms is already engaged in around inclusion. For us at M&G, it was really important to begin measuring inclusion right from the start. And for two reasons. One, as Josh was saying, it starts to reinforce the work that you as an organization are having on the inclusion. Is what you're doing really delivering a positive impact to the individual? As the guide shows, it really takes employee engagement to the next level. Do I feel included? Do I feel safe to speak up? Having that level of measurement also then continues to drive positive impact, and you're able to scale in areas that your colleagues are saying are making a difference, and it helps you uncover where the gaps are. How do you hold leaders accountable if you don't move from measuring awareness through employee engagement to inclusion? How am I feeling as an individual? One of the questions you may have that I'm asked frequently is about survey fatigue. So the intention today isn't to say an inclusion index needs to be separate and distinct. Actually, at M&G, we've built our inclusion index into our employee engagement survey, really understanding that inclusion is a level of engagement that we hadn't looked at before. Moving from questions such as, do you believe as a colleague M&G supports diversity and inclusion, to asking the questions about your manager, your team. The first question is awareness. The second really is about impact in your role and who you are as an individual. The second, by developing an inclusion index, has also made us think about the impact of other areas such as well-being. And now we've introduced a well-being index on the heels of an inclusion indice. And that again continues to really make our overall engagement survey more robust. So we're not talking about adding on, we're really talking about shifting, right, the processes that you have in place to measure the impact of the great work that's going on. And really, I'm going to reiterate, it's about an inclusive workplace, it's about the safe and speak up culture, and are our systems and processes inclusive? Additionally, as Josh was saying toward the end of his presentation on the guide, I think it's very important to recognize as our HR systems become more robust and more forward-looking, we look at improving our data collection around diversity and inclusion. And you heard Georgina talk about the importance of self-identification around our LGBT plus community and our disability community. As those systems come together, it helps you really recognize, right? Is there a difference in the impact on the work of inclusion across a specific demographic in your organization? This all comes together very nicely. So for us at M&G, it was very important. We put an inclusion indice in place in 2019. We measured again in 2020, and we saw an 11 percentage point improvement in inclusion. That reinforced during a really unprecedented time of lockdown that the work we were doing was having a positive impact, and we'll be measuring inclusion and reporting in our annual report next year at the end of our employee survey this September. It really continues to enforce the work on diversity, inclusion in your organizations. So with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to come on screen, and as they do, to join me, I'll introduce them. First, we have Anna Jernova. Anna is a Senior Manager of Governance, Remuneration, and Controls Policy Team in the PRA Bank of England, and was one of the lead co-authors of the recent D&I discussion paper. I'm also joined by Rebecca Antonini, Corporate Development Manager for Sentier Investors, and Claire Tunley, the CEO of the Financial Skills Services. Sorry, Claire, I'm never going to get it right. I'm just going to say the FSSC, and I hate acronyms, but I'm going to do it. So with that, thank you for joining me. Anna, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you the first question to get us started. And that was in regards to the recently launched discussion paper on diversity and inclusion in the financial sector. What role do you see the regulator playing to improve culture more broadly?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you again for having me as well today for the launch of the guide. It's a great initiative. So, to firstly answer your question, so culture is important from both a prudential as well as a conduct perspective, because we know that a negative culture in an institution can adversely affect prudential and conduct outcomes, and can lead to firm failure as well as misconduct, and so negative consequences across the board. So looking at the discussion paper that the PRA published this time last week alongside the FCA and the Bank of England, which the focus of the discussion paper focuses on improving diversity and inclusion across the financial services sector. And part of the reason of why we have put this forward and also looking at it in the context of culture is that we believe that greater diversity should support having a range of views across an organization, as people bring different experiences and therefore, again, points of view to the table. But diversity in itself isn't enough. So you need to have an inclusive culture to create this necessary environment for individuals to be able to speak up, to express these different views, and also to raise concerns. And we believe that combined, having diversity and inclusion should help reduce the risk of groupthink and also the risk of poor decisions going unchallenged, which we know is one of the factors of not only the 2008 financial crisis, but also a number of events that have happened since, including, for example, the LIBOR scandal. So to help drive this change, in the discussion paper, we set out a range of ways that we think we can leverage our central role as regulators in order to drive change across the UK financial services sector. So hopefully many of you will read the discussion paper. I'd say it's a good read, but I may be biased. But some of the measures include things like regular data collection and disclosure to allow monitoring progress, and I'm sure we'll talk more about data soon. We talk about the importance of tone from the top, which has already been mentioned by other speakers. And here we talk about the importance of having diverse boards, accountable executives, and also linking progress on this to remuneration, which again, you have that will help you get that tone from the top and help set the right culture when it comes to progressing D&I. We also talk about some of the firm-wide policies and practices that could be introduced. So, for example, the importance of building up a diverse pipeline, having training, having diversity and inclusion policies within organizations so that people understand what good looks like and what they can expect. And then we also talk a little bit about some of the regulatory measures that we could then take on top of these in order to help drive change when it comes to, for example, past non-financial misconduct. So what we hope to achieve with the discussion paper is that combined and looking at these measures together, you would get change and progress across diversity and inclusion so that it becomes incorporated into business as usual for firms, and particularly where it's not the case at the moment. And again, done sort of a number of these steps taken together will also help promote a positive culture. As Georgina mentioned, this is a discussion paper, so we are very much open and interested in views, as particularly over the next few months. I think that's all I wanted to say at this stage.
Anna, thank you. I just want to sort of wrap up something that you said and tell me if I got this correct for everyone else in the audience. And that is back to, and I know this sounds like a bit of a broken record, but what gets measured gets done. And really about building trust is it is measurable. And it's very important from a culture standpoint to have those measurements in place, but to take it in the totality. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yes. Good summary.
So we did ask our audience to put questions into chat as we go. And I'm just going to pause for a second and ask Josh if we have any questions before I move on to Rebecca. Josh? So I'll take that as a no. And Rebecca, I'll come on to you. Can you tell us where you and your firm are on diversity and inclusion? And what do you see as the challenges coming forward?
Sure, thanks, Mark. So to give a bit of context about us, First Sentier Investors is a global asset management firm with around 1,000 staff across 10 countries. We're active specialist investors who share a common commitment to responsible investment principles. So from our perspective, the business case for diversity and inclusion is quite clear. Firstly, diversity is core to our values of responsible investment and stewardship. And secondly, asset management is a people business. So diversity of thought and experience is commercially critical for us to bring a unique perspective and a differentiated approach. But despite the clear business case, we've experienced much of the same challenges as other firms across financial services in terms of attracting diverse talent to our industry, extracting meaningful data, and navigating the breadth of information and resources that are available so that we can really focus on the actions that are going to make a meaningful change for our business. Adding to that, the stability of investment teams is really important within investment management. So it can be quite challenging for us to move the needle really quickly in terms of diversity metrics. It was great to hear and see from Georgina around the FCA's focus and commitment to culture and diversity and inclusion. And I think that's only going to have a positive impact in our industry. In terms of our journey more specifically, we started with diversity, and over time we've expanded our focus and introduced a number of initiatives and partnered with a select number of firms that we felt aligned to our broader objectives, including joining the Financial Services Skills Commission. And through these initiatives, we've made some progress, but we acknowledge that there's still a long way to go. More recently, we've actually had a group of passionate individuals across our business somewhat naturally come together to form a working group focused on inclusion. The group had a really strong view that a bottom-up approach to complement our broader strategy would be the most impactful way for us to drive change, engage our staff, leverage their diverse experiences, and provide them with a forum to have a voice. So we've since established 6 diversity communities, which are each sponsored by 2 members of our leadership team. These communities are made up of staff from across our business and focus on gender, disability, ethnicity, LGBT, socioeconomic diversity, and neurodiversity. Each community is accountable for initiating and delivering tangible actions that either add to or improve inclusion within our business or the wider industry. Our communities haven't been in place very long, but we've been genuinely overwhelmed by the level of interest and engagement across our business. And from my perspective, it's not only been actions and contributing to the communities, but it's been really pleasing to see that people are actually thinking about it in their day-to-day jobs. And it can be really simple things like a manager stopping to check with HR or their community members to ensure that the interview process that they're implementing will support neurodiverse candidates. And I think it's the sum of all these little actions at an individual level, combined with tangible actions at a group level, that are really going to help us to attract and retain diverse talent into the future. But we also need to measure our progress and ensure that the actions that we're taking are addressing the issues that are being raised by our staff. So from our perspective, the Inclusion Management Guide is going to be a really useful tool for us to do so, in particular by helping us to adapt the survey over the 4 levels within the tool as we make progress. I'd agree with Mark's comments earlier around the benefit of the guide, and I'd add that it's actually just really helpful that someone has done the hard work for us. the guide is practical, adaptable, and I think it can be really easily implemented alongside other systems and processes that organisations have in place. I imagine for smaller businesses or firms who are just sort of starting on their inclusion journey, that in particular is going to be a really helpful tool. So from our perspective, we're very excited and pleased to be part of the Commission, and look forward to using the tool and tracking our progress.
Rebecca, thank you so much. And really what I heard you saying is it's not an either or, top down, bottom up, but it's really engaging all colleagues at all levels, listening, but then taking that work and putting it into action. That's important. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our staff need to be engaged and buy into it for us to make real improvements.
And that's not unlike what we do as firms, right? We listen to customers, we ask them questions. How does our product get better? And then we deliver those products. And what you're saying is take those assets as an organization that you have and turn them internal.
Good summary, Mark.
Great. Claire, I'm going to come to you. And we do have a question in chat. And I think this is fair to pose to you. And that is, it's clear that regulators are focusing increasingly on diversity and inclusion. How far is this measurement guide a part of the toolkit for regulators and firms? So I think the question really is, how does the guide intersect with the industry regulators and vice versa? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I would like to say it's the guide that everyone should coalesce around. But I think the guide was born out of the request from our member firms at the Commission. When we started our work just over a year ago, looking at inclusion and diversity, and particularly on inclusion, it was the sense that this was something firms are coming to. But there was little commonality in approach, and really firms are saying, we want to know where to start, we want to know where to progress and mature what we're doing, but we want to do it in a way that is coordinated, and so we are all measuring similar things, we can benchmark, and we know that we're going in the right direction, and that's where the guide came from. I do think there's we've been in discussion with some of the regulators about developing this, but also with other organisations, so the FSCB, Financial Services Culture Board, and other organisations working in this space, the IA, etc., to make sure that it aligns with things that are there. This is making it sure it aligns, and as you'll see in the guide, where we've aligned the questions on the different levels to things that already exist, particularly around the FSCB's questionnaire, which I know many firms participate in, but not all do. That was the purpose behind it. So I think it is a toolkit. I'm very supportive of it, of course, and I advocate for this guide. And what we really did want to build in is that maturity and approach. So small firms that are coming to this, and the Commission as a small employer, we've only got 5.5 staff, looking at this ourselves. How do we start with level 1 and getting that data and understanding how we're being inclusive, because it just really sets it out very straight. This is the question you ask, and then you can start to collect the data. I think the next steps for some of this will be more firms coming to collect this data, and through the Commission particularly sharing that, so that we can provide that overview of where competitor firms and the sector as a whole is. We do a lot of this data collection and share it with our firms, not disclosing individual firm outcomes, but giving that overall sector view, because it gives a sense for people where they're positioned. But also what it does do really strongly is pick up on really good practice from things like Bex has said, that we've heard from yourself and Irene, but other firms that are doing this. And I can imagine many firms picking this up today going, are we level 3, are we level 2? Where do we think, where can we make adjustments? And that's exactly what the purpose behind it is, that we can set out this common direction for firms. So I do hope it becomes a toolkit for firms and regulators, but I do know that regulators are very keen that firms take their own leadership on this and take responsibility for their own activities, actions, measurement, reporting, etc. And this guide is meant to be a part of that toolkit to help firms do that.
And Claire, would you say it's fair that the Commission really has brought together firms across our industry, and that the guide is a culmination of good practice from firms who are at very varying levels of measurement of inclusion? So in essence, it's not an academic exercise, it's really a best practice sharing from organizations within the industry already.
I'd say that's right, and that's one of the purposes of the Commission existing, is to bring the efforts of firms together so that we can all improve together. I'd say across the Commission we've got firms, the smallest has got 45 employees, and the largest are the big names that have got several thousand. And what the common area is, we're all making progress on these particular issues together, and we can learn from each other. And I would say not one firm has cracked it all. I think there's very, very good practice in every area, but everyone's got some areas where they would like to improve. And that's the point of the Commission, to really bring that collective effort together so we can make that joint progress.
Right, thank you, Claire. I think this next question that's come in is going to be directed a bit more at myself and Rebecca, but Anna, I'm also going to ask you to come in on this from the standpoint of working with organizations and what you've seen. And that is, the question is, could I ask the panel, please, what their participation levels are with regard to staff contributing to data collection surveys? So I think this could be either an inclusion and engagement question, or even a data collection and around self-identification, Rebecca. And then perhaps say something about how do you improve disclosure rates. Rebecca, do you want to take that first?
So I think from our perspective, we have a bit of a way to go in terms of our data collection. So I think we've found as a global business, getting metrics that are consistent and relevant across the different locations that we operate has been a little bit challenging, but it's definitely a focus for us at the moment in terms of our diversity metrics. In terms of inclusion, I think traditionally we've very much focused around more engagement, much like a lot of other firms. And so I think the next stage for us is really using the tool and using the information that we have available across all the things that we've talked about today to actually take that to the next level. So I think if organisations sort of take the opportunity to use that information and accompany that with, really direct and honest conversations with their staff, which is probably much easier for smaller organisations as well, who have a much more direct relationship with a broader part of their population, then that will go a long way to improving our collection and management of the information.
So, and I'll add to this, and then I'm going to go to Anna and Claire. I'm actually going to ask you to come in around data collection, because I know that's a huge phase of work for the Commission. What I've seen in my work is asking the question whether it's about self-disclosure on entry into an organization, or if it's about inclusion in the inclusion indice within the employee engagement survey. It's about building trust. So upon entering an organization, if I'm able to self-disclose, for me, that starts to say a lot about the organization, right? Whether I choose to self-disclose or not, that's my choice. But having the option to then doesn't cast doubt on your diversity and inclusion strategy. And simply being able to disclose as a gay man or as a person with a disability, then that continues to build trust over time. From an inclusion standpoint, what I've seen is that asking the personal questions, again, builds trust, that the organization is really interested in how I'm feeling and what my experience has been. And then it's important to move on that, to recognize what our colleagues have said and very visibly continue to build that back into your work, which again builds trust over time. And what I've seen is our data collection rates have gone up, and our engagement in our colleagues engaging in our surveys has gone up over time, because they don't see it as just an academic exercise. They see the work then really coming to fruition throughout the year. Anna, do you want to give us your perspective?
No, sure. I agree with what you've said. That so firstly, I expect that different institutions vary in terms of the level of participation they get from their staff, and also on which particular aspects the employees choose to disclose. I also expect that participation levels may vary at different points. So I think, Mark, as you said, you can get upon entry information, but also you do quite often get surveys and inclusion surveys. And there is a risk of survey fatigue from staff, which may then, as a result, get fewer responses. But I completely agree with you that it's important to be clear what the information is used for, and what benefits it could bring, so that people feel safe in reporting it. And as you say, the trust part is key. But we do need data. You need the data to be able to understand where the issues are, to monitor progress, to understand where do you need to target particular interventions, and then also whether those interventions are actually working. So getting that message across and helping build that trust, I think, will help participation levels.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Claire.
Absolutely, I agree with my colleagues on the panel, and we actually undertook a piece of research and added an advisory guide on our website last year on data collection, just trying to sort of break down some of the challenges and some best practice that we'd heard from firms. But coming back to the broader data piece, which again I mentioned, the Commission gathers data across the membership to get a broader view of what's happening. Just to share some findings from our survey, which it is last year, but disclosure rates across firms did vary hugely, from 1/3 to up to 90%. And I think where we did see some of that higher level of disclosure, it was clear that those firms had been on this journey for many years. So it just shows there's a longer term strategy required. This isn't something you can suddenly increase overnight. It does take that time and that ongoing commitment, that leadership, and building that trust has been mentioned. And I think what was positive though is all firms are collecting some form of data. The external reporting is much more limited, and there's many reasons for that. Most of the data, as we know, is on gender and race and age, inclusion data. Other forms of diverse characteristics are much lower and much more variable. What I do think is interesting with your point, Mark, is about some of the entry routes. What we do find is there's actually a lot more data on people applying for roles within firms, whether that be a graduate or experienced high level, than actually the workforce in firms. So there is something about that entry point, and I'm struck by one of our members who shared that whenever they do something active, an announcement, something on social media, some diversity initiative or inclusion initiative, some good news, they immediately see an increase in visits to their recruitment pages on their website. So there is something about the reputation and the attraction and being committed to this agenda of diversity and inclusion actually resulting in increase in applications. And given that the Skills Commission is all about tackling the skills gap, widening that talent pool as broadly as possible is key. So that commitment to D&I, increasing your talent pool, we're looking more into this, but I think there's an absolute tangible link there.
Claire, we're spot on 10 o'clock. I'm just going to give one last data point to reinforce what you said. I can tell you that I track communications impact at M&G, and that you're absolutely right. Our engagement in social media comms around diversity, inclusion, and well-being is 3 times that of any other communication that we put out. So people are interested, potential candidates are interested, investors and customers and clients are interested in what we're doing from a culture standpoint. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. I'd like to thank Claire, Josh, and the Commission for having me and allowing me to host this morning. And Rebecca, Anna, and Claire, thank you for joining me on the panel today. And with that, I'll conclude our session and say goodbye. Thank you all.